naturally weird kids, but anybody kids like that. Oh, this guy's got to be pretty scary.
Okay, now you're a wanderer.
Yes.
So we will, if I may, yeah, now touch it. Okay. Now, consider how present. When you come to speak, I will do my part for anyone who might be. Yes, I can acknowledge and do it right. Okay. Yes, it works.
I was kind of looking at the lighting yesterday. People stepped away from the podium. It was pretty dark.
Okay.
Just that.
The lighting automatically does go down, except you can adjust it. So you're all set up there.
Let me see how this works. Yeah.
Yep.
It does what it's supposed to do.
Thank you. Michael, just with regards, are you an old whiz on the old thing here?
You know, actually, maybe if it's can the lights just stay as they are.
They can stay as they are. They automatically go down, so Michael will have to turn it on. Then we go back to room. Go to the mate. You know how to do that?
Let's just.
What I'm thinking
is I'm going to
walk
around a little bit.
You want to wander?
And it's a little bit dark.
Yeah.
Like this.
Where is it? Room.
Yeah.
On. I think that's the way it works. Yeah. Is that cool? Yeah.
Let's do that.
We can lower the spots behind at the front.
Oh.
Right. Yep.
Next. There's that one right in the middle washing it out.
Keyboard, light, left table, right table, full row seating light. Doesn't seem to be happening. Alright. Try it.
Well, don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. If you can see it, then see it. That's good enough.
What time, Mr. Wolf?
And let's see, so it's not this on. Can you turn these off? The mic is on? Is that how hard is that?
Nice.
Yeah, I know. The best way to do it would be to down. It doesn't matter. And the only kind of thing to remember is you've had questions after this, have you? Or yeah, just to restate all the questions because we don't have issue audio from the floor, so it's kind of like on the webcast it's blank, and then you say yes 12 times and twice on Sunday. Yeah, kitchen room. Okay, so you do that. And I'll send down a little one of my staff down to take a few photos. I know that's not distracting. And it's just a pop star and it's just newspapers. Right, okay. Good. I'm glad it's not just me. I'll talk to you. At the end of the session, what I'm going to do is just witness you up, get a few outside photos if I may, without answering streaming guides, and that's what you said. Yeah, I'm just paying that big time for about 40 grand. Right? What time is that? Do you want to wait till 10 minutes? Yeah, sure. 6 minutes. Thanks, Mike. Okay, welcome back
to day 2. I hope you survived the Indian summer evening. This morning we've got our second keynote speaker for the conference, Professor Bruce Bimber. As you can see, Bruce is the Director for the Centre of Information Technology and Society, and also Professor of Political Science and Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The Centre for Information Technology and Society is a multidisciplinary research centre at UCSB that investigates the human and societal dimensions of information technology. Bruce's specific research interests involves the relationship between the evolving information technologies and changes in human behaviour, with particular regard to the domains of political organisation, collective action, social capital and political deliberation. His most recent books include Information and American Democracy, Technology and the Evolution of Political Power, which came out last year. And also last year he published Campaigning Online, the Internet and US Elections. He's also written on the politics of expertise in Congress, the rise and fall of the Office of Technology and Assessment, as well as numerous articles dealing with politics and technology. Bruce started out in electrical engineering and then at Stanford, and then took out a doctorate in political science from MIT. And as we can see today, he'll address us on the citizen in the age of electronic governance. I'll hand it over to Bruce now. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Good morning. We're here at the halfway point in the proceedings, and I'm finding the conference so far very stimulating, and I hope you are too. And I'd like to begin this morning by putting you in mind for a moment of Stephen Coleman's keynote address yesterday. I found his very erudite and interesting discussion just right for the following reason. He began with democratic theory, and I believe, as a matter of deep intellectual conviction, that our discussions of politics should begin whenever they can, not with numbers and polls and the causal mechanisms of social scientists like myself, but with a conception of what is good, with democratic theory. And so I think that he really set just the right platform for beginning the conference yesterday by starting with democratic theory and moving towards a conversation about technology and politics. I want to provide for you today what I hope will be a complement to that. I'd like to come at the question from the level of the individual, from the level of the citizen, and I'm going to talk more about behavior than theory and more about political psychology than about normative conceptions of what makes for good representation or good voting or good democracy. I want to do that by focusing on the citizen. It seems to me that the citizen is a challenging aspect of our models of electronic democracy. The citizen is quite obviously everywhere. The citizen is in every aspect of what we talk about when we talk about electronic democracy, whether we're talking about campaigning or governance or social capital or policy making. However, I think that in many of our discussions, and I indict myself here as well, we tend to leave the citizen in the background, or at least we leave the citizen underdeveloped. It's very tempting to focus on the technology. It's tempting to focus on the elites who are building the technology and providing it to the citizen. And I think as a result, sometimes we don't develop an adequate conception of the people who are ultimately going to use the technology. The theme of my talk is what you see here. And that is that e-governance is only as good as the citizens that use it. Now, that's very prosaic, I admit, and that may seem obvious. It may seem too simple. But I want to suggest to you that the more you think about that problem, the more challenging it becomes to those of us who study politics and those of us who are practitioners of politics and democracy who are attempting to make things better. Another way to put this is that technology evolves very rapidly, but humans, of course, do not. We know, I think so far in the study of electronic democracy, we know a lot about institutions and their trajectory over time. I think a lot of quite good work has been done on how electronic governance moves from simple information delivery and service delivery to more rich systems that can engage citizens, that can empower them, that can do things like representation, that it can begin to achieve some of the things that Stephen Coleman talked about yesterday and that many of you have been talking about in your panels. I think modeling that, as hard as that is actually quite a bit easier than modeling what happens to citizens over time. What do citizens do? How do they respond to electronic governance? Do they make the transition fully or not, and why is that? And I'm thinking here not just of the pioneer citizens, the political entrepreneurs, the activists who are most likely visiting your website if you have a government website or a political website. I'm talking about the larger polity. And it seems to me that citizens frequently fail to live up to technologists' expectations of them. As Michael said, I was once an engineer, and if you'll indulge me just a tiny bit of biography, I'll tell you how I came by way of my concerns about technologists. I grew up in Santa Clara County, California, which is known more broadly as Silicon Valley. And when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, up and down the street, the parents of my children were all, the parents of my friends, the other kids I knew, were all engaged in the electronics industry. The fathers, and it was a very traditional gender role community in that time, the fathers got up in the morning, they drove north to the electronics companies, and they built technology, and they came home at the end of the day. And those who weren't engineers or engineering managers or executives were dentists who cleaned the teeth of the people who made the technology, or doctors who kept the people who made the technology healthy, or lawyers who kept the people who made the technology out of trouble or got them in trouble or what have you. It was a technology-centric community, and I took up the local trade. I just was swept along in the current and was socialized into that scene and earned my union card, which is an electrical engineering degree, and I went to work for the local shop, which was Hewlett-Packard. And that is where I was exposed very intensively to how the people who build technology often think about humans. And I came to the conclusion that one of two things was going on. Either the people building the technology didn't think about humans very much, or they did think about them and they fundamentally misunderstood humans. Because the humans didn't use the technologies in the ways that the engineers expected them to, and they used technologies in ways that were quite surprising. Partly out of that experience, I decided to go back to graduate school and become a social scientist and try to figure out, in a sense, what the hell was going on. And I learned really that both of those effects were true. Citizens often fail to take advantage of the information and the services that we give them. They use the technology in surprising ways. That's not a failing of the citizens, it's a failing of expectations. These are the questions that I'd like to consider with you this morning. That's the notion of my theme, that e-governance is only as good as the citizens who use it. It's so easy to get the citizen wrong. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the Internet was subject to a great deal of early speculation and very optimistic expectations about what might happen. And we all know that those expectations so far haven't panned out. The trick is to avoid recapitulating that exercise. And most of us think we know more than we did in the early and late 90s when we were speculating about these things. But I think a great deal of caution is warranted. Americans in particular have been susceptible to an unwarranted faith in the notion that new technology improves citizenship. This is not only a question about media, about the Internet, but this is a historical article of our civil religion in the States that goes back to the founding and to the Enlightenment. At many moments of technological change in the United States, people have looked at technology and said, not simply the technology is getting better, but citizens are getting better. I'm not a student of Australian popular culture and media, so I don't know so much about the case here, although I suspect that Australians have been substantially more sensible about their technology than Americans have. You may be familiar with some of these cases, and indeed people make a sport of recounting the mistaken predictions about technology. But these fascinate me and they chasten me. And I want to suggest just three. If you'll travel with me for just a moment to some technologies that have nothing to do with governance, and that's the point, then we'll return and take up the theme of electronic democracy. Let's talk for a moment about the steamboat. Steamboat was invented in the late 18th century and was put into use on American rivers in the early 19th century, 1800s, 1810s, and was the dominant mechanized mode of transportation until the railroad in the 1870s. And the steamboat was really important politically in the United States. It was important in foreign affairs for one reason, because much of the westward expansion that was going on and the politics involved in the United States and Britain and France and Spain and a little bit Russia was a question of the capacity to control the rivers and transportation. So steamboats were an important part of politics. The steamboat also precipitated the first regulatory agency. This is an odd little tidbit of fact. Steamboats blew up a lot in the mid-century, and they hurt people. And actually the first time that the federal government regulated a business in the United States in order to protect the health and safety of citizens was the steamboat. So steamboat's got a really interesting sort of political history. But what's most compelling for me is the faith that some people had that the steamboat wasn't only moving people and goods around and playing part in the geopolitical battles of the United States as it acquired territory and expanded west, but that it was making citizens somehow better. I'd like to read you just a really brief one-sentence quote from a contemporary magazine. This is Hunt's Merchant Magazine in 1841. The author here is discussing the steamboat, but he could just as well be discussing the Internet. He writes, "In exact proportion to the extension of political freedom and the diffusion of popular intelligence has been the advance of invention and the popular arts." What's going on here? Technology, in this view, is not merely taking advantage of human intelligence. It's actually, in this writer's view, expanding human intelligence. It's not only that technology is diffusing. The logical mistake here is the notion that popular intelligence is diffusing. Now, in hindsight, we can look back on this, and this is amusing. This was a lot to ask of riverboats, frankly, to make people better. But it is an example of this Enlightenment enthusiasm for progress that has confounded people's thinking about change, material change versus human change. This point, by the way, comes from Langdon Winner, not my own. The automobile, for a second example, in the early 20th century, the automobile precipitated a host of speculations, many of which were quite wrong. It was going to be an environmentally superior technology, by the way, by ridding the streets of horse manure and the decaying bodies of horses and so on. That was off. But the car was going to do other things. It was going to promote autonomy and tighter citizenship. Outing magazine, to quote another contemporary writing in 1902, "Because of the car," this person writes, "the millions of our rural population will be brought into closer relations with the towns and with neighbors, and the loneliness of farm life which drives so many to the cities with detriment to all will no longer retard our agricultural growth or prevent a proper distribution of the population for the national welfare." So the car here is going to stitch together and tighten the social fabric. The notion was that if the technology could do it, then it would. People would obviously use the technology to advance citizenship because they could. Here's my favorite and the most sobering of these notions about technology and citizenship. Aircraft. The development of flight, and particularly the capacity to fly between nations in the early 20th century, prompted some remarkable predictions. One cited by Sven Lindqvist in his book, A History of Bombing, predicts that regular human flight in aircraft would bring an end to war. Why would it do that? Well, obviously, if humans could bridge distance, bring themselves together, connect across cultures, we would have therein the death of war. A kind of global citizenship would emerge from the mere fact of the capacity of humans to interact in new ways across distance. And of course, instead, aerial bombing became the mainstay of war, and my own country has been perhaps the most horrific practitioner of using aircraft to bomb in Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Vietnam, and of course the use of aircraft against the United States in 9/11 gives the final lie to that particular expectation about aircraft and peace. There are many others. Radio, to which Stephen alluded yesterday. These are fascinating to me, and I think that they should not be dismissed so easily as we think about our own technologies right now. I want to be very clear here that I do not intend to belittle citizens in any way for failing to take advantage of flight and steamboats and cars, or the internet for that matter, to improve the quality of citizenship. On the contrary, I think it is enormously disrespectful of citizens in democracy to impose on them these expectations that are so unrealistic. These are also not cautionary tales about the development of technology or against electronic governance. They are a reminder simply that while technology changes very rapidly, habits of human behavior and human psychology change quite slowly. And so the trick to getting it right, if we are ever to get it right, is to understand that difference. The challenge is to imagine the citizen correctly. So that's what I'd like to do with you here this morning. Here's where we're going. I want to discuss two questions with you. One of them is whether the internet leads people to more civic engagement. This is a theme that has cropped up, a sub-theme at several points throughout the day yesterday, and I think will appear again today. I also want to talk with you a little bit about how people learn online. These are interrelated questions, to be sure. Then I want to talk about how to accommodate some real practices of citizenship, lest you be sitting there thinking that I'm preparing a diatribe against electronic governance. I'm not. I want to suggest some things we ought to be thinking about as we build electronic democracy that are cognizant of at least two principles that we already know about what people do with information technology. And my caveats are that I'm going to be reporting mainly from the U.S. context. I am quite aware of the specter of American exceptionalism, and so I don't presume that in all or even most of the cases that what Americans do is the same as what anyone else does. But if you believe that Australians and Europeans and those around the rest of the world are different from the United States, I think there's at least some merit in knowing precisely what the contours are of the American situation and how it is that, what it is that you are different from, if you are. Certainly the frenzy of internet activity in the United States over the last year in connection with our campaign has confirmed some things we know, and it's raised lots of new interesting questions. I'm going to talk just a little bit about our campaign in my remarks today. I'd be happy in the question and answer to talk more about what's going on if you'd like. So, with those as caveats, let's take a look at this first question here. Does the internet lead to more civic engagement? This is actually an ambiguous question, and to get the answer right, you need to parse it into two. The first is whether the internet leads more people to civic engagement, and the second is whether the internet leads engaged people to be even more engaged. And the reason that it's important to parse this question into these two is that the answers are different. In the first case, the answer that we know so far is basically not much. It doesn't much lead larger numbers of people into the public sphere. It doesn't help assist people cross the boundaries of the public sphere. On the other hand, if you ask the question whether engaged people become more engaged, the answer is yes. If you ask the question whether the internet makes engaged people be engaged in different ways, on different issues, the answer is a resounding yes. So there's a lot that's going on that's interesting, but we need to keep an eye on what is different and what is not. What do we know so far? Let me begin with the first question here. There's a fair amount of survey research so far that shows the internet in all its guises has had very little salutary effect on overall levels of engagement in the United States and in some European countries as well where the data has been collected. In almost all cases, the people who are using e-governance, the e-citizens, are the same people who were engaged before. The people who are reading news online are the same people who read news offline, and they read both. For the most part, there's not a substitution effect. we find that the internet is serving the people who are otherwise engaged. And by the same token, in the United States, the people who are traditionally disengaged, we have a lot of them, are largely remaining that way as a result of the technology. It's important to get that right. You can think of this as a preaching to the choir effect. The technology is indeed, in many cases, preaching to the choir. Now, that's not all bad. It's good to the choir, for the choir to be preached to, I suppose. And if it's not extending the metaphor too far, it's just different to preach to the choir than to preach to new converts in the congregation. There's a related take on the question which looks not only at political engagement, but at social engagement, social interactivity. This is the social capital question, and here the picture is quite similar. Internet use is positively related to social interaction. The people with the largest social networks tend to make most use of the internet, and those who make use of the internet tend to expand and extend and deepen their social networks. There's a positive kind of reinforcement effect. And the least social people make least use of the internet. That's pretty straightforward. The questions that have been asked in the social domain really mirror the questions that have been asked in the political domain. So if you plug those together into a conception of sort of civil political society, you get really a similar kind of outcome. There are some refinements on this. It's very important to distinguish modes, aspects of the internet. Email and social software is not the same as commercial websites. If you ask these questions that I'm asking here about email, about gaming, about the commercial web, you find the answers vary, and that's important. So I would only be real clear to point that out. What does this all add up to? Well, I'll give you a word for it, and that is reinforcement. The primary effect of technology that we've seen so far, this is not the exclusive effect, but the primary effect, has been to reinforce people's behavioral inclinations. Stephen Coleman yesterday suggested rightly that Weberian bureaucracies have been very good at taking the technology and using it to do what they're already doing, to deliver bad services more quickly. I love that analysis. I think he's absolutely right. There is a parallel phenomenon at the individual level, and it shouldn't surprise you because what are institutions but structural aggregations of people, individuals. At the individual level, we find that technology is used in a similar way. People use the technology to do the things that they're inclined to do anyway, and they much less frequently, although not never, use the technology to do things that are wholly new. For many, it has been a remarkable fact that in the United States and in many other countries, essentially every political organization and institution of note in the space of only a few years, really half a decade, 3/4 of a decade. In fact, that every institution has taken up this new set of media in a way that is more rapid than any previous media. It's more rapid than television, which was fast, radio, which is fast, much more rapid than the diffusion of newspapers, which was generally slow. Despite that overwhelming and abrupt impulse into the political institutions, in the United States, anyway, the long slide in civic engagement, in voting and in other forms of involvement has continued unperturbed. That's very important to think about. Now that's the main effect, and it may seem discouraging, but there are some interesting things going on. And here's what to look for. Here's the effects at the margins. Here's some of the latest research just from the last month or two in some cases. We do know that despite this primarily reinforcing effect, that new media do, for some small number of people, reorient political behavior. There's no question about that. There's a small number of people that show up in lots of studies, my own and others as well, who buck the trend. They're small in number. They are statistically difficult to work with. They are so small. The profile is roughly what you would expect. In age, they are young. In education, maybe it's not what you'd expect. They are neither well-educated nor poorly educated. They have moderate levels of education. And politically, they are moderate. They are not extreme. There's actually some theory that would lead you to predict something roughly like that. These folks have shown up in a number of studies. Lupia and Philpott reported in a paper last month from an experiment that exposing, in an experimental setting, young adults to political websites did cause measurable increases in political interest, at least for the duration of the experiment. There's a lot of issues surrounding external validity, of course, in an experiment like that. But that is hopeful and suggestive. They found that increases in political interest were connected to the perception on the part of people of the site's effectiveness and efficiency, whatever that means to individuals, which undoubtedly varies. There's a study from George Washington University that reports that there are a substantial minority of people engaged online who have not before engaged in political acts in the U.S., particularly donating money. You'll recall, sadly, that the ultimate political act in the United States is not voting, it's giving money. And we are finding that there are people who are giving money this season who have not before. That's not the best measure against democratic theory of political engagement, but it is one that works, and there's a little evidence in that direction that they found. I also saw that as far back as '98 in my own work. A colleague of mine at Santa Barbara, Ken Jennings, and one of our graduate students, have been involved in a very long-term longitudinal study. It's actually mind-boggling. They have interviewed the same people over the course of almost 30 years. They began in 1969 with graduating high school seniors. They interviewed them 4 times between '69 and the present. And the nice thing about that panel design, that they've looked at a lot of things, but that brackets at the end the rise of the Internet. And so they were able to ask some very interesting questions about whether the people who were online in 1997 were more engaged than the people who weren't. And they could control for the very same individual's behavior before the rise of the Internet in the 80s. And what they found conforms to what I have on the screen here, namely that Internet use does indeed have a stimulating effect on political engagement, mainly for those who are already engaged. The people who in the late 80s were highly engaged turned out to be even more engaged as a result of the Internet. The effect is not big, but it's there. We have a great deal more to learn on that, and I would suggest this is an enormously profitable area of research. Lastly, in this regard, I have to bring up Howard Dean. Certainly the most important political effort so far in the area of campaigning was the candidacy of Howard Dean. Just a few facts. Most of you know the outlines. Most of you may in fact know more about Howard Dean than many Americans do. But here's some outlines. Dean started his campaign in December of 2002. As you know, campaigns for the presidency of the United States are roughly 2 years in duration. The public phase is nearly 2 years in duration. He began in December 2002. He had $157,000. He had no organization. He had no name recognition. The one thing he did have was the disdain of the Democratic Party. He became quite rapidly the front runner, as you know. He left the race a little over a year later, having been the front runner for quite some time. He had 400 to 600,000 followers online. 300,000 of them reportedly had given money. That's a lot of people donating money in small amounts. He was the first candidate ever in the United States since the beginning of our public funding system, the first Democratic candidate, to opt out of public funding. He abandoned public money in favor of raising money in small amounts online. Again, a dubious distinction, but one that is a distinction nonetheless. He did a lot that was novel. His focus on a network-based campaign, his willingness to let go of the structure of the campaign and let it, in many ways, self-organize was really powerful. Now, with respect to the questions that I'm talking about here, there is a lot of anecdotal experience that suggests that Dean did indeed mobilize people who were not previously interested or engaged in politics. No one has any good numbers on it. It comes from participant observation at campaign events, at meetups. It's informal. We really don't know the dimensions of it. The research so far that we have done up to this point suggests that there ought to be a few, but they ought to be small in number. If it turns out that there were a lot of folks, this would be stunning. It would indeed be a remarkable development. But of course, Dean was crushed, and he fared quite poorly when push came to shove, and that really, in many ways, is symbolic of the bigger picture of the Internet. Namely that it does reinforce, in many ways, more than it transforms certain aspects of politics. All right, so reinforcement is just a principle I want you to have in mind. It's not the only story, but it's the beginning, the foundation from which we should begin asking questions about what's novel, rather than asking what's novel from the outset. Let me turn to this other question. How do people learn online? This is coupled, it's connected. This is a big question. And again, there were a lot of mistaken understandings of how people would learn online in the United States. In the 2000 election cycle, a lot of money and a lot of energy went into the building of civic information sites, voter information sites. The big philanthropic organizations put a fair amount of money out there. Lots of organizations built civic sites on the premise that people would go online undecided, confused, or unclear about what they wanted to do. They would use these very nice sites that would allow them to gather information, that allow them to type in their zip code, for instance, and find out every elected official standing for re-election at that point, their party, what their platform was, their issues on positions on issues, and so on. And then through this incredible encyclopedia of information, the people would come to a view. They would arrive at a choice about what candidate to support. They would become more informed. They might even become more engaged and more excited about elections. We're doing it again, although not quite as aggressively as we did last time. There's a number of very innovative, creative sites doing that in this election right now. These don't work very well. They don't work for the following reason. People who go online for political information overwhelmingly have fairly strong views and predilections and preferences before they arrive at the website, before they plug in. In my own research, Richard Davis and I did a lot of work experimentally and also using surveys, looking at who went online, what they thought when they went online, what the effects of being online were. And what we found is that people overwhelmingly, by the time they arrive at one of these sites, they know who they're going to vote for already. They're looking for reinforcement. They want to learn more about their favorite candidate. That's a very different question than going in undecided and forming a view because of what the Internet tells you. This isn't a bad thing. This is a polarizing effect. It's rather than a moderating effect. And it comports actually quite well with what we know about how people have used media from time immemorial. We know specifically that people's interaction with media is dominated by processes of selective attention and selective acceptance. People are enormously selective. What do they attend to? They're highly selective on the basis of their prior beliefs, their values, their orientations, their partisanship. What do they accept of the information that's presented to them? They accept information that tends to reinforce what they already believe. We tend, all of us, to notice information about issues that we care about, and we tend to notice information from perspectives that we agree with. We are enormously predisposed, as a feature of the human mind, we are predisposed to maintain our extant beliefs. We're quite fierce, actually, about maintaining our extant or our prior beliefs in the face of new information. It's a very powerful psychological dynamic. We enter the world of the Internet. We enter the world of online communication with habits of citizenship, with priors, with beliefs, with partisanship, and we find information, we notice information that tends to reinforce it. Indeed, so powerful is this orientation that we, when confronted with neutral information, are likely to perceive it as biased away from our own views because of the fact that it's not obviously biased towards our views. This is sometimes related to a contrast effect. We have a very difficult time sorting out our own orientation from others. In fact, there's an interesting experimental effect that we could do, even in a body of august thinkers like this one. If I were to present you a string of 100 assertions about politics, or frankly about anything, but particularly politics, and if I could construct, let's stipulate that I could construct these assertions in such a way that 50 of them support something that you believe, and 50 of them challenge something that you believe. If you're an environmentalist, so 50 of the facts may report on the malfeasance of energy companies. If you're not an environmentalist, if you're a business person, maybe 50 of these facts report on the importance and value of the energy economy, what have you. You will believe more of the supportive facts than the facts that challenge you, despite the fact that they are all constructed to be true. That is to say, your mind will not serve you well in gathering information because of your willingness, your tendency to believe and misbelieve in ways that reinforce. Another way of putting this, as a political scientist, I am obligated as a professional norm to take a shot at economists whenever I can. And so let me say that what I'm telling you is that people are explicitly, thoroughly, entirely not rational in the economist's sense of going online and obtaining information to reduce uncertainty in a strategic kind of way. We go online knowing what we want, and we come away believing it even more than we did when we went in, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. Now, you can ask why that is. I think it's a very interesting question. Why, as a biological matter, that is true. We might speculate a little bit about that if you want. There are people who think about that. All right. Let's think across media for a moment. We're talking about the internet here, but let's just go back to a couple other media really quickly. Given this predilection that we all have to be very selective, to in the economist sense, misuse information, to get it wrong, think about newspapers, think about broadcast television, and think about the internet. For all its faults, broadcast television, particularly in the old days of limited channels, broadcast television was a medium actually that tended to confound some of our selective attention. When you watch the 6 o'clock news, you are likely to be surprised, at least comparatively. You're going to get the news that they've chosen to give you. Now, you can channel surf, you can tune in and out, you practice your selective attention and your selective receptance of information, but you are confounded a little bit by the fact that you are, in a sense, passive, a passive receiver of news. The research shows that newspapers permit greater selectivity. Why is that? Because we can choose what to read and what not to read. We can scan the headlines, we find the headlines on those stories that interest us. We can choose those opinion pieces or editorial pieces that reinforce what we like. If we're reading an opinion piece and we don't like the political direction that it's going, I do, and I imagine you do, stop, and you look for something else. The newspapers not only give us more information, but they permit us to be more selective about what we read, and in those places where there are more than one newspaper, where there are partisan newspapers, we can be even more selective. There's some interesting research on that, actually. Well, think then about the Internet. The Internet is the mother of all selective media. It gives us the greatest capacity of all to choose just what we want to see and to believe what we want to believe. It wouldn't have to be that way. It could also be the medium that permits us precisely the opposite if we chose to use it that way. And that's, I think, the way a lot of people have conceived, a lot of technologists have conceived the Internet, that we would use it to challenge our beliefs, to explore new things. Now, academics may do that, but we're not typical as academics. What people tend to do online is to practice their predilection for being selective. If we're disinterested in democracy, if we're disinterested in citizenship, the Internet's great. You don't have to be confronted with it if you don't want to. If you're interested only in sports, you can pretty well just navigate sports. If you're liberal and you want to hear only liberal information, the Internet is a good place to go, and so on. All right, so one of the major themes that I'm working towards here is that these basic human traits of selectivity are not changed by the technology. The technologies, in fact, can, in this case, facilitate even greater than some of their predecessors are inclinations. So, the species of interest here, which is Homo sapiens, has these traits, if we think like biologists for a moment. The environment that the species is in is changing quite rapidly. The species itself is not. All right, so this sounds like a very pessimistic story. Is there no hope? What can we do? I don't intend to be pessimistic. Let me suggest some ways to accommodate these traits. And I do this in the spirit of being respectful of who humans are. I think that's actually the best that we can do, is to not ask that humans be different. I want to suggest 6 areas for discussion. This is hardly an exhaustive list, but it's, for me, the kinds of questions that arise and the kind of conclusions that one comes to having traveled this journey through a look at human behavior. And I'm assuming that some of you are interested in these from the perspective of practitioners and some from the perspective of researchers, so I'll try to orient my remarks in both directions. First question here is, how can we indulge citizens in what they're already interested in? This is so important. There's been so much effort, particularly in the United States, given to the notion that we're going to create new interests, that we'll build it and they will come, that we'll create government websites that will generate citizen concern for issues that they're not paying attention to. Well, that's not all bad, but that isn't sufficient. It might be necessary, I'm not sure, but it certainly isn't sufficient. The issue is to avoid the trap of assuming that elites will tell citizens what to be interested in, and that they will come. The challenge is to create ways using technology for citizens to develop and act on whatever their interests are, no matter how parochial or silly they may be. This requires a fair amount of forbearance on the part of political elites to say, we're going to give you technology, and we hope that you'll use it for the things that you're interested in. And we have our agenda, but we want to know what your agenda is also. How does this work in the long run? Well, the hope needs to be, and there's some evidence in the literature on social capital to suggest that this works, the hope needs to be that by engaging one another online in whatever it is that interests them, whether it's football or woodworking, that people will form habits of engagement, habits of sociability, that they'll extend their networks. They'll develop the kind of skills and orientations that just might translate into the kind of more explicitly political civic engagement that we're mostly interested in this conference. I believe it is patronizing. I believe it is a misunderstanding of citizens to think that electronic governance will create citizens who are interested in things that they're not inclined to be interested in the first place, at least as a direct kind of primary effect. What else? The digital divide is important. It's important because it exacerbates existing inequalities. Whenever that happens, that's bad. A lot of concern in electronic governance, it seems to me, has gone into the digital divide. I think that's right. I think that's appropriate. Reaching out to the less engaged, reaching out to the disengaged, and trying to renew citizenship that way is important. But there has to be much more to it because that is such a hard row to hoe. We know that from so much behavioral data. I think it's very important for practitioners of electronic governments to keep in mind that much of the dynamics of online democracy, frankly, will crystallize and work around opinion leaders, around activists in various communities, not the disengaged first. That we may reach the disengaged actually by starting with the engaged and letting some of the citizens do the work of reaching out and extending networks. We do, of course, as practitioners of electronic governance and as researchers, need to think about reaching out to citizens electronically. We do need sometimes to present issues that may not be on the public's agenda. Of course, government has the responsibility not merely to listen to public opinion and to listen to the direction of the political winds, but to create agendas and to present them to citizens. Of course, that matters. The question is, how do you do that? Well, online posting and waiting doesn't work very well. A lot of energy in the United States went into posting information and waiting for people to come find it. As you know, that's not a particularly successful enterprise. When we need to bring new issues to constituents, when we need to try to change the agenda, we have to find ways to be proactive, to reach out, to use electronic mail rather than flat websites, to use social software, as it's now being called, to find ways to engage citizens proactively. We need to use recommender systems, that is, technology that makes inferences from people's behavior and recommends to them things that may be of interest on the basis of what the system has observed anonymously about other people. Anyone who's been to Amazon and had books recommended to them has seen a very simple recommender system. But that kind of technology can do a lot more than sell books. It can help engage citizens. It can tell a citizen who's come to a government site to request a form or to post a message. It can, these kind of systems can say, hey, we've noticed that other people who've done what you just did are also interested in some of these other things. We thought you might like to know. That's being proactive. It's using the intelligence of the system to reach out rather than simply posting and waiting. One of the simplest things that is being used in campaigns, it was pioneered by the campaign of Al Gore in 2000 at the presidential level, is to ask a really simple question of citizens, and that is, do you want email? What do you want email on? And importantly, how often are you willing to receive it? The Gore campaign was very effective in 2000 in saying to citizens who came to its site, okay, so you're thinking about maybe voting for Al Gore. Tell us where you live. Tell us the issues you're interested in. Do you want email from us? And how many times a week do you want email? And we'll tailor our system to you. We'll reach out to you on your terms. A fourth and extremely challenging area to think about is how to give citizens the opportunity to shape discourse, not merely vote on the agendas of elites. An awful lot of emphasis has gone into finding ways to use technology to incorporate public views, to find ways to listen to the public on the agenda of elites, to create what are essentially new kinds of plebiscites. This is an issue that resonates very closely with what Stephen Coleman is concerned with. This is fine as far as it goes. I actually think it's a fairly bad idea to use the internet to engage citizens more in voting, at least in the United States. We have way too many elections. We have too many questions on the ballot. We have citizens legislating in many of the states through ballot referendums. It's not a good idea. Citizens are overtaxed. They need to vote, frankly. This is heretical. They need to vote less, not more. And they need to vote more deeply rather than shallowly. The technology, we are finding, generates the most excitement when people are asked not merely to vote, but to shape the discourse and the agendas that eventually lead to decisions down the road, that lead to voting decisions. Much of the excitement behind Howard Dean's campaign in the United States fed on this. It fed on the notion that citizens were helping to shape what he was doing, what he was saying, what the strategy of the campaign was, both financially and rhetorically. Indeed, the campaign of Howard Dean is symbolic on just that point. At the stage in the primary process where people were engaged in shaping the outcome, in saying, here's what kind of candidate Howard Dean will be, here's how the campaign will be run, that generated an awful lot of enthusiasm, but frankly, when it came time to vote at the end, as you know, the Howard Dean campaign fell apart. We see that in lots of other venues, not only campaigns. Citizens want a chance to shape discourse, not merely vote on the discourse of elites. Fifth point here, facilitating citizen-to-citizen interaction. An awful lot of work in e-governance has gone into the notion of disintermediating the relationship between citizens and government. Indeed, there has been a great deal of disintermediation of the relationship between citizens and government, and that is fine as far as it goes. But one of the major lessons of just the last year or two, I believe, is that what citizens want is disintermediation of something else. They want disintermediation of interaction with other citizens. I think this idea was lost on a lot of technology developers who presumed that technology would be best improved by technology if we could bring the government down to the people and connect them more tightly together. What citizens have shown us is that they're not so interested in that. They're interested in drawing closer together with one another. It turns out that citizens, frankly, and this shouldn't surprise you, they get a whole lot more excited about interacting with one another than they do with interacting with government. And that's a fine thing. And out of that may, in the long run, come an improved public sphere and an improved system of governance, but it takes patience. If it's not demeaning to our species, I want to use an analogy from the behavior of canines. I'll be just a little bit personal here. I have a dog. I'm kind of a nut about dogs. I'm fascinated by what dogs do. And this does relate to e-governance. I'm not off my rocker here. There has been a spate of books over the last decade or so about dogs and the relationship between dogs and humans that explores the often quite sophisticated connection. And there's, I think, a lesson from this kind of alternative literature, actually, for e-governance. One of the best of these books was early on. It was a book called The Hidden Life of Dogs. If you happen to be a dog fancier and you haven't read that, you might want to, by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. She asked a social scientist's kind of question, a behaviorist question, and that is, what do dogs want? What do dogs want? And she had in mind a set of hypotheses about that were really quite nice, I thought, as a social scientist. She had some behavioral hypotheses about dogs wanting to play out their inherited impulse to hunt, to play out their genetic predilection for pack behavior and dominance and submissiveness relationships. She wondered whether the dogs are trying to play out their co-evolutionary relationship with humans. We believe that some dog behavior, some people do, may have been shaped by the fact that they were domesticated so long ago, and so on. Her methodology for testing these hypotheses was to follow around a bunch of dogs. She followed a pack of dogs around for several days at some length. I guess this is what social scientists would call a loose kind of ethnography. And she arrived at an answer to the question of what do dogs want. It's a very simple answer. Dogs want other dogs. That's all. That's it. It's just that simple. They want the companionship of their own kind. Well, as I follow people around on the internet, it seems to me that I see time and again that what people want is other people. They don't want government. That doesn't mean they're going to ignore government. That doesn't mean they're bad citizens. It means in the first instance, we should be thinking as governments about how we can facilitate people finding one another. I'm not talking about dating services here. I'm talking about social software, about meetups, about Yahoo groups, about email chains, about emergent self-organizing groups. We know that interaction breeds more interaction. It breeds trust, generalized social trust. It breeds larger civic engagement as well as a number of other things. So the lesson from that sort of whimsical story is that people in the first instance aren't trying to get connected to government. They're trying to get connected to other people. And I think it's been really a difficult notion, a challenging notion for the builders of e-governance systems to imagine that what they're really going to do is just facilitate people getting together with one another in a way that's uncontrolled. This has been terrifying to political campaigns in the United States. Actually, in the 2000 campaign, again, of Al Gore, there was a tiny bit of experimentation with this. This was really the predecessor to what happened this year, using instant messaging. The Gore campaign set up an instant messaging system that allowed people in a region who were Gore supporters to find one another and interact, to send messages. They did very little of this, and frankly, it scared them to death. It scared them to death because it risked their losing control of the message. The notion that a campaign would facilitate an uncontrolled conversation about the candidate that could even make it into the news, that would be about who knows what subject or topic, was terrifying. It was anathema to the way the campaigns are run in the United States. It still is anathema to almost everyone except Howard Dean, who embraced that principle in the extreme. That's one of the reasons he flashed so fast. He tapped into the notion that people were looking for other people, just like dogs. All right. And finally, then, I have a last point that is my most speculative, I suppose. What's the next big thing? There is a next big thing, and it's going to be wireless. Let me remind you what I think you already know, and that is that two technological developments are underway right now that are quite powerful. One is the extension of wireless availability to computers nearly everywhere. It is quite likely that we'll have wireless access at a level that we now have access to cell phones. And so we'll no longer think of the internet as something you plug into for the most part, unless you're lucky and have wireless access. We'll likely have region-wide, possibly nationwide, possibly global-wide wireless. That's part of the story. The other technological development, of course, is that the devices in our pockets, the PDAs, the cell phones, are merging with our computers. And we will indeed one day have devices in our pockets that are as powerful as our laptops now. It's not clear just how they're going to work. We may communicate by talking to them. They may communicate by talking back. We may type on them. They may have fold-out screens. They may unroll with paper-like screens. They may project images for us. It's not clear what the interfaces will be like. But we know quite soon that the internet will be in our pocket. It will go with us everywhere. That's going to be real time. We don't really have any notion of what real time is yet. We will when we're online all the time. And the challenge, I think, is to imagine the internet not simply as computers on tables, but as something that's with us all the time, that's like our wallet, that's like our cell phone. So the question is, what kind of interactions and behaviors will we have then? In what ways will we use that kind of technology to reinforce our behavioral patterns, and on what occasions and under what circumstances might we break out of some of our habits? The telephone is a mundane kind of analogy here. It clearly went through just such a transformation on really a tiny scale. Think about what happened when we unplugged the phone, when we developed cell phones. Some things changed a lot, and frankly, some things didn't change very much. We like our cell phones and we hate our cell phones. This is going to happen with the internet as well. We obviously made a lot more phone calls. We are making a lot more phone calls than we did. But we're doing things unexpectedly. Cell phones are contributing to things like flash mobs, spontaneous or near spontaneous gatherings of people doing things sometimes silly and sometimes meaningful. One of the great surprises, I think, of mobile telephony is that people use their phones to send text messages. Who would have thought that having the capacity to talk anywhere, anytime, people would convert into an frankly old-fashioned and awkward function, and that is typing little messages to one another, sending little text messages. Certainly not what phone companies had in mind. Certainly not what the prognosticators about technology had in mind. And I would submit to you that we will do things as retro and unexpected with the internet when it's in our pocket as we have done with cell phones. A very sort of practical matter of governance and phones, but one of life and death, is the overloading of emergency systems. In the United States, emergency call centers are at and beyond their breaking point because of cell phones, because they fail to imagine what would happen when people can make a phone call anywhere, anytime. About a third to half of calls to emergency systems come from cell phones in the United States. Call centers are unable to handle the volume, frankly. There are reports of as many as 100 telephone calls reporting a single highway accident. That's a kind of information overload of an old system that frankly, governments were quite unprepared for. In California, one study showed that about a third of people who try to reach an emergency system have trouble getting through, and 12% just don't get through. That is, 1 in 8 people wanting to make an emergency call just don't get the help they're looking for because of the way we use our phones. We have an information system suddenly made unsatisfactory by the fact that the phone is mobile. It's the same old function we had before, calling and talking, but the fact that it's mobile makes all the difference in the world. I think the challenge for e-governance is trying to imagine what will happen when the internet is as mobile as cell phones, when people are constantly connected, when they are constantly navigating a world of information, filtering information, selecting information, and also creating data as they go, like it or not. The question is, what will people do then, and how will governments respond? It seems to me that we can hardly think too much about that question. What will it be like when we are always online, maybe even when we're asleep and agents, avatars, bots are working for us on the nightstand? God forbid. Cognizant all the while we need to be of the fact that the basic psychology of what we do with media, of what we want, is not changing. A final aspect of political psychology that I think, human psychology that matters here is that, of course, we privilege the present when we look back at history. I think many of us, myself certainly included, tend to feel like history was simply a prelude to the present, that all of history was the unfolding of what we have now today. Francis Fukuyama, who was invoked before, is hardly the first person to fall victim to the notion that that all of history was simply working up to the present. Certainly that's not the case. Certainly we know that technological change, anyway, proceeds in an accelerating pace, typically often a geometric kind of pace. And what that means is that what's coming in the next 10 years is undoubtedly going to be more shocking and surprising in the way of technology than what has come in the last 10 years. As unimaginable as the things we are working with today seem, there is no doubt that we're going to be faced with even more surprising technology in another 10 years, all the while being the same species with our same inclinations to behavioral reinforcement, the same predilection to be selective in the way we understand and navigate the world. I think that's a kind of thrilling and sobering kind of question. What will all that be like? Well, I don't know. I have my ideas. Maybe you have your ideas. I think all we know is that we're going to be surprised, and that makes it exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Bruce is happy to take questions, comments. Hey.
Yes.
Got this misnomer of private citizens, and very good in America pointed out that citizenship is a public entity. I just wonder that given the use that people make of the internet for a lot of commercial engagement, with their use for this one-on-one purchasing arrangement, and a lot of governments are actually, service delivery is doing the same kind of thing, how effective the internet can be in reiterating the public nature of citizenship rather than private, consumer, self-interested citizenship activity.
Yeah, good. Let me just repeat that, paraphrase as best I can for people who might not have heard that on the other side of the room. The question is, given the enormously commercial orientation of the Internet and the tendency of even e-government providers to think of citizens as clients, that is, consumers, how do you work with that? How do you reorient citizens to non-commercial kind of enterprise? Well, certainly the lessons of Western culture over the last 50 years, I think, are pessimistic about the opportunities to orient people away from commerce. Part of what you're asking about is really a cultural change, and we know that culture changes very slowly, but it does change. I would point to actually the dog issue, people looking for other people online, as the most vital non-commercial activity online. We're seeing very interesting forms of engagement online, and it's not only online groups, that is to say people interacting online. One of the great surprises was Meetup, which for those of you who may not know, Meetup is a commercial website, meetup.com, that came online several years ago, and the notion was to provide a way for people who get together in their neighborhoods, in their cities, and talk with other people interested about an issue, a common issue. And so Meetup facilitates gatherings at public forums. There's actually a Meetup tonight in Melbourne. I don't know where. It's for American expatriates. I'm not going, but if you're interested, you can go to a pub and there'll be a bunch of folks there. Meetups took off much more rapidly than anyone thought. People getting together. There are thousands of meetups occurring all over the world. And it's a simple information problem, and that is you and someone over here both happen to have an interest in some subject. You don't know each other, and you don't have a way to coordinate. The website just provides that service, and people are getting together face to face. What's exciting about that is that no one I know who was thinking about technology thought that people would use sophisticated technology to get together the old way. So much hand-wringing has gone on about the virtual replacing the physical, about the online world being, the simulacra of real engagement. What we're seeing is that people, when given the tools, are using the technology to get together the old way and have a beer and talk about something they care about with strangers. I think that's quite optimistic. And this is one of the things that's surprising, and then I'll end this remark, is that meetups went political really fast in 1993. By mid-1993, 30% of the meetups, thousands of meetups, were about politics. The meetup people had no idea that was going to happen. They had a brand new market on their hands that they hadn't thought about. The candidates, including Howard Dean, had no idea and hadn't organized this. So that's quite optimistic, I think. If you haven't looked at the meetup site, you ought to do it. It's interesting. Meetup.com.
Marcus? I'd like to ask a question about the 4 A's: anonymity, aggregation, accumulation, and analysis. For every interaction on the internet, there's an accurate trace. For every bit of history, you can't lose it. For every person who gets communication, there's an accumulation of a trail. We have a situation, or many situations in society, where people have multiple names or NIMs. There is no recognition in privacy legislation, in government, in identity tracing of the NIM as a valid process. In fact, the ironing out of the anonymity when it's not needed, just for a temporary one, is proceeding apace. That particular trend undermines many of the exchanges and many of the assumptions that underpin the discussion. I'm very interested in your expansion of your points.
Yeah, the question here is about anonymity as one of the major confounding factors in the health of online interaction, the health of the building of civic sphere. Certainly, any sophisticated and useful notion of the public sphere of political deliberation requires that people give an account and give reasons and take responsibility for their views. And anonymity obviously would confound that. Undoubtedly you are right that anonymity is often a problem. It's often what we're looking for online, and we often wish we had more of it, as a matter of fact. Some of the research shows, actually, that the more engagement people have online, that is to say, the more emails they send, the more hours they spend on time, the less anonymous their interactions are. That is to say, as people build deeper networks online, anonymity tends to decay rather than grow. That's just the sort of optimistic response. Anonymity tends to be a little bit more strongly associated with light, thin engagement, and it does indeed go in the direction that you'd want over time.
Harry?
Yes, the question is about deliberation online, and has there been enough? Is there work that might confound, that might suggest ways that people break out of some of these habits online? There's a growing amount of work. A lot of it actually comes out of the study of collaboration in workplaces. That's where the bulk of the literature lies. There's a lot of work on small group communication and psychology that transferred into online computer-mediated communication, typically in work environments. And some of that applies well, and some of that doesn't apply so well to open public sphere deliberation. I've done a little bit of work on that myself, experimental work. We don't know so much about it. There's been some good work done actually at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania that suggests that online political deliberation can indeed work. It's hard. It requires a lot of investment. It requires a lot of moderation. It requires repeated interaction over time. One-shot online deliberation doesn't work so well. It can disrupt some of the dynamics that happen in face-to-face interaction. There are unfortunate gender dynamics in a lot of face-to-face interaction. Roles evolve, we know, when people get together and physically interact. Men are often more aggressive in face-to-face settings. Some of the research actually shows that some of the role development is confounded, that women often contribute better comparatively in an online environment. One of my colleagues has done some work who find that women enjoy anonymity in online groups more than men because it breaks some old gender stereotypes that tend to disrupt effective communication. So, yeah, there are some hopeful stories there. I would maintain that those don't override the sort of main behavioral traits, but there is some good work there. I would encourage you to look at the work of Vincent Price at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's got the best work on that by far. Not the actor, by the way. Vincent Price, yeah.
Questions?
Yes.
I was very interested by your whole discourse. I'm particularly concerned, though, that what you're outlining really potentially destroys the internet for me as a user. Two particular points. First being, want to engage those users that click to you. The organisation is basically going to identify you as potential vote. This seems to me like spam. The second point is information can be very speculative taken up, and to object towards this, to give people information in their life that critical to them. And is that really a good decision-making mechanism for people? Are we actually improving things, or are we just giving them something they want?
Well, the question is, I think, although you were nicer than to put it this way, am I recommending that we pander to people's basest impulses in online governance? And the answer is no. We should not. I think we want to have in mind the goals of stimulating new kinds of interest and new kinds of civic engagement. But I think the point is to approach that with some finesse and to realize where people are coming from. And to realize that in the first instance they're likely to be motivated by things that already interest them, and try to move them from there to the places that you might like them to go. So I guess I'm suggesting a realistic kind of design that nudges people where we want them to go, but that doesn't aim high or so wide of the mark that we end up getting it wrong. I think you can, I think you can preach wisely to the choir. And perhaps get where you want to go, but I think I would disagree that that's kind of a question of just pandering. It's a question of being realistic. Yes.
Bruce, Michael Mason, as a politician, making it very difficult for me to go back to those of my colleagues who don't pass the selection, who are ignorant or suspicious of the technology, and persuade them that they should go any further than simply providing information and services online. What should I say to my colleagues?
The question is, what should public officials do? What should candidates do? No, I think my answer, I think my story is actually a positive one, and there was an angst and a hand-wringing about that happened in a part of campaigns in the United States when this realization hit that the people coming to websites are already supporters. You're not going to change very many people's minds. So what are you going to do about it? And the game in the United States is different a little bit, the political game, than in Australia, because the dynamics in the United States are largely about turnout. It's in a country where half the people vote in the general election and many less than that. What politicians are concerned with is trying to mobilize their base, and this technology is fantastic at that. The website and email lists give you a direct connection to the people who care about you most. And That's different, of course, than changing swing voters, getting people to cross over from the other party and vote for you. But it's certainly fundamentally valuable to have a kind of close and enthusiastic connection to people that allows you to reach out to your base and stay in touch with them over the course of the campaign. Serve them new messages. Give them organizing kits. Be sure that they turn out. Be sure that they bring their friends to the polls, that they try to persuade people. The candidates who've been the savviest, I think, are those who have realized that the technology can help them work with their best supporters, rather than those who thought that they're going to change minds. And that's a sophisticated function. That's not a post and wait function. That's a question of finding out who people are, where they are, what they're interested in, what kind of networks they're plugged into, what kinds of engagement they're willing to be involved with. I'll give you an interesting story from the Howard Dean campaign about that. That again goes back to money, which is such an issue in the United States, not so much a fundraising issue here. One of the savviest uses that Howard Dean made while he was a candidate before he went away is that he appropriated his opponent's material and strategies himself. When Vice President Cheney and George Bush would announce a fundraising event, the Dean campaign would say, look, Dick Cheney is going to be in New York raising money from fat cat Republicans on next Thursday. Give money to me. We need to raise our own money. The Dean campaign actually linked to ads, anti-Dean ads, run by his opponents, and said to his supporters, look what these awful people are saying about me. Look at this anti-Dean ad. Isn't that awful? And he was right that would mobilize his supporters. Very effective. He basically used his opponent's campaign spending and fundraising for his own purposes. So I think there's a lot of creative things that can be done, given the constraints that I've described. Yeah, the question is that, could the online engagement, political deliberation, just substitute for real engagement with real issues? There is some evidence in that direction. There's a lot of evidence, though, that suggests the opposite, that it does translate over. I wish I had a silver bullet for you on that, but I don't. I think the issue is to trust that there is a value to human interaction online, human communication, and that in the long run it may translate. It often does translate. That may sound like an evasion of your question, but I think that's probably about the best that you can do.
Yep. I'm very interested in this idea of selecting and reinforcing behavior. Unlike some of the other people, I think this is sort of a holistic concept. What you're talking about. If you accept that our civilization is constructed on selective behaviors rather than physical form in our brains, we're not that to assume otherwise, that the concept of a rapid evolution of selective reinforcing behaviors is very interesting. I'm particularly interested in that idea of the discourse through Meetup over the last year, the sense in which that might be something that activists try and encourage, we try and see to push forward, but we've had spontaneous moves towards political discourse through that before Meetup. And it seems to me that whilst we're right in saying that was already an influence and interest, the truth of the matter is that perhaps there wasn't the space for the execution of that need or the delivery of that need. And Meetup was delivering that. I'm interested in that concept, your comment on the concept of whether it really is retro behaviour, reinforcing a behaviour people are already doing, or whether in fact the scale provided by Meetup for new political discourse or new spaces for political discourse is of such import that in fact it changes the whole nature of political discourse.
Yes, the question is, does something like Meetup really change discourse? Might it change discourse? And I'm fairly optimistic about what happened with Meetup, what is happening with Meetup. A lot of the energy and enthusiasm that went into people getting together in these kind of spontaneous, literally self-organizing groups, came out of a sense that this was an anti-establishment exercise, that this was not only anti-establishment with respect to government and elected officials, but that it was a subversion of the mass media, that it was a way to get a hold of discourse and venues, political venues, and participate in a discussion that was in some way subversive, and that was really appealing to people who were politically, what we can tell, for the most part, pretty politically savvy, but alienated and turned off by other opportunities. And so the big question is it a novelty effect? What will this, is the attraction its newness and it will fade or not? My guess is that it will not continue its very rapid trajectory, but that it may well institutionalize itself over time, but maybe at a little more quiet level than it looks like it could right now. Certainly I will say, I have not been to a meetup, although I keep an eye on them, but I know a number of people who have, people in my university, some of my colleagues have organized meetups, and they would never otherwise invite people to a political conversation. But this provided a kind of legitimacy and a sense that they're participating in something that was valid, but it was anti-establishment and it might work. It's a subtle kind of finessed sense of what was going on. And I don't think we fully understand it yet.
Brian.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question about the some characteristics of people using the internet. I run a website that has a permanently what I call multi-partisan point of view. So that sort of issue of people going where they tend to go.
Yeah.
We deliberately try and challenge that. We find when we talk to people quantitatively and qualitatively that they say that's one of the things we like about the site because it's comprehensive.
Yeah.
However, we also do polling from the site, quantitative and qualitative for politics. And when we do a poll, if say the Greens are on 9% of the vote in the normal quantitative polls that are being done properly by telephone or whatever, they'll be 30% in our polls. And what I find is I have a lot of trouble finding Liberal voters or centre-right voters. I don't have much trouble finding centre-left voters. I'm just wondering if there's any work being done on the characteristics of people who use the internet, whether it suits the habits of people who are of a particular political persuasion rather than another.
Yes, indeed. Great question. Is there a kind of inherent affinity for this technology from one ideology or another? And the answer in the United States, and I would imagine this is the place where this extrapolates the least to other places, because partisanship and ideology are so different in our system. The early research showed a very strong libertarian bent. This is in the early 90s. The very early adopters were heavily libertarian. What we find now is a pretty close recapitulation or matching of the general ideology of voters. And indeed, as the extent of the online population grows, the partisanship matches up more closely. So there doesn't seem to be any particular affinity one way or the other at the individual level. However, this year it is the progressive, more left, in American terms, liberal elites that have by far been the most innovative. So things look liberal, actually, in the United States. The main online group, the most important online group, is Move On. It's a decidedly progressive group. The Dean campaign, now the Kerry campaign, a number of other organizations, independent organizations, have been mobilized from the left, and so things look pretty liberal right now. I would imagine that this will change by the next election because of what we know is that underlying it, things seem to be pretty broad in their appeal.
We're starting to run out of time, so if people have got questions, I'm sure Bruce will be happy to chat over coffee, but we'll just take one more question, and then we might... One more.
I have a question about electronic voting.
Yes.
You've been on issues.
Yes.
Let's go back to, where Bimber and everything happened. What is your prognosis for what's going to happen given the last U.S. election and the Chad fiasco and all that failing things versus your point earlier about participation being the gold standard in terms of what happens in the election? What is the dynamic is the dynamic going to happen in terms of the electronic voting
Yeah.
option against that.
Okay, yeah, the question is whether we're going to have another 2000, another Florida, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm simplifying what you said a little bit. And what about electronic voting? Let's see, there's a long answer to that, but I think the shorter answer is that both the major parties are assuming that this will be a very close election, again, that there may be battleground states as close as Florida. It might be Florida, it may be Missouri, which is always a kind of bellwether state, and it could be Ohio, Pennsylvania. And both are assuming that mobilization and get out the vote drives in the last week will be crucial. They're using a lot of technology, a lot of sophisticated data mining techniques that are being pioneered right now to do micro-targeting, to reach out and to try to swing a few percent of voters in a few districts in order to try to win the game of Florida if there's another election that close. Now, the other part of your question was, what about the technology itself? There's a long and ironic story there. The United States has invested a lot of money in upgrading our voting technology. There are four main technologies in use in the United States. They all undercount. Historically, about 2% of votes cast in the United States are not counted. That's been true since that's the 1988 to 2000 average. All measurement has inaccuracy. Voting does too. You undoubtedly have an undercount, a residual count here in Australia. I don't know what it is, but in the United States it's 2%. It varies with machines. The worst machines are the punch card machines. They undercount as much as 3 to 4% of the vote. The best machines are old-fashioned. They're lever machines. They are optical scanners, which are 30 years old. We have been buying ATM machines like mad, electronic machines. They are not the best technology in terms of undercount. Some counties may actually have an increase in undercount from last year because of the shift to ATMs. ATMs will eventually sort themselves out, but their undercount rate is not nearly as good as scanners, optical scanners. It's a case of people buying the latest and greatest, and it actually is not, in terms of undercount, the best technology. There's also a huge issue of verification. How do you recount? The best plan on the table so far is to do two things. To print receipts, so that after you dial in your vote at the ATM machine, you get a printed receipt so you can verify what you've done. But then here's the key thing. You put the receipt in a lockbox before you leave the polling booth. And if there's a recount, you do it the old way. You open the boxes and you count paper. So far, that's not available. We're not going to be able to do that in 2004. We could have big problems. California has mandated receipts by 2005 and 2006. It'll take a long time because we control elections state by state for that to work. As long as we remain closely divided, which is the way it looks right now, there could be more mischief. Sorry to say.
Well, on the theme of mischief, we might finish there. Thank you for your questions. And thank you, Bruce. For great questions. Good morning, Peter, sir.
Turn this off. I've always worried when I lecture, I've always worried I was going to take a brief broadcast. Yeah, it was good. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.